This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 318, Backdrop CMS. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Backdrop CMS with Jen Lampton. Jen owns a small Drupal and Backdrop development agency. She's been a Drupal developer for 15 years plus 2 weeks. Very precise. I like that. And a Backdrop developer for over half of that time, right? 18 plus years. In the Drupal community, she's been a coder, a module maintainer, an event organizer for Badcamp and DrupalCon San Francisco. She's an instructor, a usability team member, a Drupal 8 core initiative lead, provisional member of the Drupal security team. For Backdrop, she's been a coder, module, theme, and layout maintainer, instructor, PMC member, usability constituent, bug squad member, and security team member. So I'm seeing a lot of parallels there, Jen. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And joining us for the next 4 weeks as our newest guest host, April Sides. April is a senior developer at Lullabot, lead organizer of Drupal Camp Asheville, member of the Drupal Community Working Group Community Health Team, and a member of the Ally Talks virtual meetup. April, happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm John Picozzi, and today joining me as usual is Nick Laughlin. Nick, what's going on with you, buddy?
Not too much this week, finally. I am on vacation for the first time in 3 years. But for the first time in my life since I was a kid, it's vacation where I have nothing planned. I'm just staying at home, and I've been doing a little bit of recording, some fun side projects and things, but I'm really looking forward to decompressing, not worrying about work for the week. So
the kids these days call that a staycation. So I'm told.
I'm looking forward to my staycation. Just one other thing I want to really quickly mention that I thought was kind of fun this week. Dries put out his contribution blog the other day, and we had talked about non-code contributions at CubCon about a week ago. And all of us on Talking Drupal ended up in the top 20 for Drupal contributors for 2020. So I was pretty proud of that. Pretty happy with that. Although I think it might have to do something to do with us adding 300 episodes of Talking Drupal to the Talking Drupal module to give credit to all the guests over the years. But still pretty happy to see our names up there.
We'll see if we can keep it going into 2022. April, what's going on with you this week?
Well, this weekend I was pretty lazy. I had plans to hang some new shelves for my Harry Potter Lego collection. So I don't know if you can see that in the background. My goal is to collect them all. So I've run out of space. I've got a backlog pile of sets that need to be assembled. But yeah, hopefully I'll have some more assembled by the next one. No, I don't know. That's too close.
I'm liking the fact that you are the first guest host to rival Nick's Lego setup. So that's interesting. And
I do see his Stranger Things set back there in the background. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's a fun one. It flips upside down too. It's pretty cool.
I over the summer we went to Nick's house for a barbecue, and I thought my kids had a lot of Legos or Lego, because I know people will correct me. I'll get mail. But no, Nick has got a lot of people beat in that area. Jen, welcome to the show again. And what's going on with you this week?
So here in California, we got this epic rainstorm over the last few days. And I've been growing heirloom tomatoes in my backyard because we bought one last year, and I went to cut it open and it was already growing. So I just put it in the soil to see what happened. And it worked. And now we have all of these tomatoes. And I went out there this morning to check on them. We finally got some sunshine, and the tomatoes had gotten so much water over the last days. They exploded. They're splitting open. The tomatoes are growing.
Oh,
fast
no.
And can hold them together. that was kind of an adventure. This is my first time growing tomatoes, so I'm learning as I go. But
it's
really,
funny
really cool.
when you started that, I was a little worried because like the last time I tried to grow tomatoes, it was like, I don't know, like a while ago. I wasn't married yet, so it was over 12 years ago. They got some sort of like disease and just died. So I thought I thought that was going down that same rabbit hole, but yeah, it didn't. It turned out good. I'm happy that the tomatoes are growing, and that sounds delicious.
Yeah, we'll see. It's starting to get cold here, and I think if I was actually a tomato grower, I would have planted them earlier in the season. So right now there's like 32 tomatoes on the vine. So far we've only eaten 3, and so I feel like we're sort of at the very end of the season. I might have to pick all of them green and then just figure out how to do like fried green tomatoes or something. But
tomatoes are one of those things that you feel like you're getting nothing. You're like, I've done all this work. I've only had one. And then the next day you have 40 pounds of tomatoes that you have no idea what to do with.
I was going to ask, are you going to eat them in salad, or are you going to make them into sauce? But if they're green, I guess fried green tomatoes are really the only thing you can do, right?
You can make relish juice.
Probably make it like a salsa or something that's a little tart. I don't know. I mean, if we end up having to do 32 at once, we'll probably try everything. So,
Interesting. I look forward to an update on that. So for me this week, I've actually been enjoying, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, just working on my personal website, which is, I don't know. I don't know if it's odd or not, but I've been just making incremental updates and just doing different things in Drupal, and not doing a ton of coding, not doing a ton of theming, just kind of trying to get things out. So the next big thing is going to be a blog. And I do remember talking about trying to find a theme for a blog a while back, but I don't know. I'm just going to go with core and see how it ends up. So I'll probably have an update about that in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, working with Drupal and doing some interesting stuff on my own website, which is fun. Moving right along, let's talk about the module of the week. So in a preparation for that blog that I was talking about, I actually was like, oh, I have this set of notes that I've used for a config training in the past, but it has code examples in it. So, I need some sort of code view for my blog. So went to Google and typed in something like, I don't know, Drupal code snippet CKEditor. And lo and behold, I got the CKEditor code snippet module, which I installed last night, and works great. Adds a little CKEditor button to your that you can put into your editor, and then you can basically click the button and pop up with a box. You drop your code in there, and it styles it, puts it into your page. Works really well. You can even set the type of theme that you want. Comes with a whole bunch of different code coloring themes, which is pretty cool. Anybody use the code snippet module for Drupal? No? Well, you can all go try it out right after the podcast. All right, let's jump into our primary topic. So Jen, as we were talking about before we started recording, it's been a while since you've been here to talk to us about Backdrop. Can you just remind our listeners what Backdrop is?
Sure. So Backdrop is the Drupal fork. It's essentially a version of Drupal 7 that contains most of the features you'll find in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, but built on the Drupal 7 style architecture. And it's specifically focused on user experience and a different market than Drupal is. So Drupal is going to be a fantastic tool for the enterprise going forward. Backdrop sort of says we are not enterprise software. We're specifically focused on small to medium-sized businesses, nonprofits, educational institutions, the kind of groups that need that complex functionality that can't necessarily afford the enterprise price tag. So a lot of the decisions we've made in Backdrop it's the same feature as you'll get in Drupal 8 or Drupal 9, but it's implemented differently with a focus on what our audience might benefit from more.
So are there other differences between Backdrop and Drupal besides the audience specifics?
There are a lot of very minor technical differences. There are a lot of features from Contrib that are included in Drupal, included in Backdrop that aren't included in Drupal. Backdrop core contains about 75 contributed modules from Drupal 7 that were either in the list of top modules that were installed in Drupal, or were features that we felt that if people had them there, they would use them, but maybe they didn't know the Drupal module existed. A lot of those are features that are common in WordPress. So we're sort of looking at the kinds of sites that might have been on WordPress before and outgrown them. What are they going to need when they move to Backdrop? And so it's more about, rather than, in Drupal, you'll often hear this like small core movement where people are like, let's put most of the stuff in Contrib and make core really lean and mean. Backdrop is kind of the opposite, where it's like, let's put everything people need in core. You don't need to go out and download and install a module. So I'm hoping to see a lot more websites running on a lot fewer contributed modules, because most of the basic functionality that you need is built in. So that's one difference. Our philosophy is also a little bit different, which is sort of shaping the project in different ways, where with Drupal, I feel like a lot of the decisions that are made are started by core developers, and so they often solve needs that core developers or people who are working on Contrib need. Where in Backdrop, we're like, you know what, the developers will figure out ways to solve the problems. We need to put the solutions in core that are going to help the people who can't write the code to get the project done. So some of the features that Drupal has, like a whole bunch of really strong APIs, aren't really a priority for Backdrop. We just want to make sure that the APIs that Contrib developers need to build that feature are there. And then we're going to work on making sure that the features that are in there are as complete and as intuitive as they can be for the site builder audience. We call them architects in Backdrop, and for the people who are using the websites after they're built.
And just out of curiosity, the modules that are in Backdrop that kind of came from the Drupal 7 ecosystem, right? Are all of those modules still active in like Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, or are some of them, kind of in Backdrop and like you may only be able to find them in Backdrop?
I haven't. Okay, so I don't know all of them off the top of my head. I do know there are a lot of them that are still active in Drupal. So there are things like scheduler module, right, that you use to schedule content for publishing in the future. That's a very popular Contrib module in Drupal 7, in Drupal 8 and 9, but it's in core in Backdrop. So this is still a popular feature. It's just in a different place. And then there are things like, file entities, right, have been integrated in different ways into both projects, so that there isn't a Contrib version of file entity anymore, but it's because there's alternatives in core for both projects. So it's kind of a hard question to answer. It's all across the board. There's also a bunch of little tiny modules that were included that I think made it into core for both systems. So things like entity view mode that allows you to add additional view modes to any type. It's both Backdrop and Drupal have a solution for that. It's not entity view mode module anymore. It's just integrated into the entity system or the field UI or wherever it goes in core. So there's stuff like that those modules don't have any intention anymore, but the features are still being heavily used.
So before we move on, are there any other reasons to choose Backdrop over Drupal? Like, are there specific verticals, aside from price, are there specific verticals that Backdrop might serve their needs better than Drupal does?
I mean, I feel like the nonprofit world is the only vertical that I think Backdrop might serve better. And a lot of our nonprofit adopters are people who are heavily invested in tools like Civi CRM. And so the Civi CRM integration with Backdrop has been really great. We've got a really good collaboration with the Civi CRM community. And I think that there are a lot of people who just were on Drupal 7 using Civi and want the same thing in the future. And it's really easy to get from there to Backdrop. And so that's a good path for those people. Other than verticals, I feel like every individual site needs to make this decision based on its own needs. And sometimes that's really hard, but things that I see people coming to Backdrop with are either very minimally customized sites where you can just sort of run the update and you're done, or very heavily customized Drupal 7 sites where you've invested a lot of time and effort into dozens of custom modules, and you don't want to have to reinvest that effort into rewriting them. So we're seeing sort of both ends of the spectrum there with I just want it to be updated in the day versus I don't want to spend a whole year writing an update for the site. So another thing too is the team you have working on the site. There are a lot of people that don't have a dedicated web team. They're just, I had my website built for me a long time ago. It's been fine. Maybe they do updates, maybe they don't. And for them, they don't have people that they can turn to if they need a module update, and they can't do that themselves on Drupal 9. But for Backdrop, like, there's automatic updates that you can push a button and have core updates applied to your site. You can install modules just from clicking a button in your application. So you don't necessarily need to have a development team to help people maintain a site over a long time, because all of those features are sort of made exposed to those people. So that also is really a dictator of which way you should go. Who's your team who's going to take care of the site in the long run?
Interesting. So let's go to a listener question. We have a question from Matt Glomman of Bluehorn Digital. Asks us on Twitter, what are the general challenges of growing the identity of a project that is a fork?
That's a very complicated question to answer because there are a lot of issues. I think the thing that's been hardest for us is that most of the people who are involved with the fork and early development of the software are developers. And so we're really interested in solving technical challenges and not very interested in marketing or branding or identity. And so we're just like, it's fine, we'll just make the tool we need and people will come. But if people don't know the tool exists, guess what? They're not going to come. So for us, it's been about just getting the word out. So for people who are using Drupal, do they know that Backdrop exists? That's our biggest challenge. We aren't marketers. We aren't good at this sort of thing. So just we're like, well, we'll set up a mailing list, and if they subscribe, then we can email them about stuff. But we don't really have a lot of outreach. So we've dedicated a weekly or bi-weekly meeting to specifically focus on outreach-related items and try and figure out how we can do a better job at that. We've got, anytime we find anyone in our community that has those skills, we try and loop them in and be like, oh, we really need you. Can you come help us in this area? So that's been really hard. Another thing too is that we're trying to not tie our identity to being the Drupal fork, because that works right now. It'll work for the next year. But beyond that, like, no one's going to care anymore, right? Like, once all of the Drupal 7 folks have made a decision about where they're going, it's just about choosing the right CMS. And so we've tried to focus most of our, at least the branding on the website and the information that's listed about Backdrop is just about Backdrop. It doesn't necessarily have to include the fact that it's a fork. And that sometimes presents its own challenges, because when we get people who are new to Backdrop who have never used Drupal, they're like, well, how do I find the module I need if it doesn't exist for Backdrop, or where do I find the documentation? And you can say, oh, well, this Drupal documentation is exactly the same. And so getting them to understand that there's a joint there can also be a little tricky, because they're like, well, it's the same information, it just has a different name on it, but how would you know that if you didn't know that Backdrop was a fork of Drupal? So we're doing a lot of work to try and duplicate some of the documentation. Like, we have a really strong user guide for people who are using Backdrop, trying to make sure that we pull over all the information we need from Drupal and rework it so that screenshots exactly match Backdrop and stuff like that. And then for the more detailed stuff, linking to like blogs or articles that are written about Drupal and being like, here's the original source of this information. You're going to need more details there in here. So trying to sort of build that bridge for people who are new to Backdrop is also a little tricky.
So along those same lines, the second part of Matt's question here, what challenges were there in being thrifty and leveraging existing platform infrastructure, such as, Slack, issue queues, Git, or VCS?
So I would say the first challenge we ran into was just limitations with GitHub. We decided to put the project on GitHub because that's what everybody was doing at the time. It seems like, if you want developers, you go to a place where there's already an audience of developers. And when we first worked, we were one of the fastest growing projects on GitHub for a while. So it was really great to be there because other people could see that from GitHub and they would just come and see what's going on in Backdrop. But it did present a lot of issues in terms of our issue queue. And we've been spoiled in Drupal for that really heavily customized experience towards working with a Drupal project. And you don't get that in GitHub. You get a very generic, like, here's a list of issues, and you can have some tags, but that's kind of it. And so we had to spend some time with sort of crafting the experience we wanted people to have using the GitHub issue queue to more closely match either what we were used to in Drupal or what we needed for Backdrop. And the limitations that we ran into immediately were the access control issues, because back then, GitHub said in order to manage an issue queue, you must be a committer to the project. And that would have limited the number of people who could create and manage issues for Backdrop to 4 people at the time. And so we very quickly realized that was going to be an issue. And we ended up setting up a separate repository that we have sort of open access on, where all the issues are, and a separate repository where all the code is. And so those two aren't joined. Of course, since then, GitHub has learned that you might want people to manage the issues who aren't committers, and they've added all of these new permissions in to handle that. But we've already built our project assuming the old architecture at GitHub. And so now we're faced with the problem of, like, how do we try and merge these back together? And how are we going to deal with our pull requests? And are we going to worry about cross-linking? And is it worth the effort of figuring that out? So the issue queue has definitely been one of the biggest pain points. I feel like the way we have it now works, although it maybe isn't the most intuitive thing for new people. So we do have to have a little extra documentation for trying to get people in there and how to use it. Let's see. There's a lot of other stuff that we found really beneficial about using existing tools. I mean, there's obvious thing that we didn't have to build anything ourselves, which is great. We can sort of hit the ground running. But for example, being on GitHub, there's a good first issue label that will show up for anyone who's interested in contributing to any open source project. And so if you use that, you end up getting people who don't know what Backdrop is showing up and being like, oh, I see a code change here that needs to happen, and I can do that. And they'll submit pull requests against their project and disappear again. We're getting like free contributions from people who don't even use Backdrop, who know how to work with the code. And we've got a automated sandbox set up using Tugboat, so that every time we get a pull request, there's a place you can test it. People don't need to have local development environments set up, which makes coding at code sprints a lot more productive, because you don't have to spend 4 hours in the morning getting everyone's computers working. So there's been a lot of really great benefits from leveraging the tools that already exist for us as well.
I'm curious about that for a second, because one of the big things in the Drupal community that's been a big benefit, but also a huge shift, is going towards merge requests with GitLab. I think that migration has been going on now for 4 or 5 years, and slowly people are migrating over, and we're seeing some of those benefits. But I'm curious if you have any insight on the Backdrop side, because starting with GitHub, you kind of had pull requests from the start of the project, right? And I'm curious, other than kind of that first time issue label that you've used, what are the benefits you've seen over the last several years of having that kind of workflow baked in versus the old school Drupal patching issue workflow?
Yeah. That's interesting. I hadn't even considered that. But one of the things I think is really beneficial about the pull request workflow is that most developers use that at work. And so when you're trying to get someone to contribute to a project, they don't necessarily want to learn a different workflow in order to do it. So trying to look at how Drupal does something and go, oh, I don't want to try and figure out how to do this patch-based workflow, is a turnoff for some people. But if it's like, oh, I do pull requests all day long, I can do a pull request here too, then we benefit from the training on that. People already know how to use GitHub, and they already know how to use pull requests. There are some downsides though, and I think that we ran into this really quickly, is that GitHub labels itself as a place for community coding, but it doesn't actually support community coding. It supports a lot of individual coders coding in the same place. But you don't have collaborative pull requests on GitHub. Every pull request belongs to an individual person. And so we have problems in Drupal where, someone will come along and create a patch, and then 3 years later, someone else comes along and fixes it. In Backdrop, when we have that problem, that first pull request has to be forked or just copied, and you lose the history of the person who originally worked on it. And so if then that person sees someone else is working on their work, they might come back and be like, oh, I was working on that. So there isn't such a clean handoff of issues when one person works on it to the next. where I've noticed that GitHub or the GitLab implementation on Drupal.org does support collaborative pull requests, where all of the branches are on the main project rather than on individual forks of it. I feel like that works better for collaboration, but it breaks the model that people are used to working with at work. And so it does take a lot of getting used to. I know when I first started using it, I'm like, I use pull requests all the time, so we no problem. And I did like 4 or 5 times. I'm like, I'm sure I'm not doing this because this is not coming out how I expected. So getting over that learning curve there too is also hard. So I think anytime you can leverage things people already know how to use, it makes the barrier to contribution to open source a little lower.
Cool. So what would you say are the biggest milestones since you were on the show last? So that would have been episode 218 in July of 2019. Like 4 times.
There's been a lot that's happened in the last year, 2 years. I'm not sure I know all of it, but I did write down some things that I think are significant. We've added a lot of new core committers recently, so I think we have 6 right now, and we've got another person ramping up to join. So that's really great. Being able to distribute the labeler across more people definitely gets more things done. We've also had a lot of changes in our project management committee, or PMC. We've had some people who are active in the very beginning of the project and now don't have time. Some people, due to pandemic, and some people due to job shifting or just responsibility changes in their life, who've stepped off the project management committee. We've had new community members who've showed up and been putting in 110% and were put onto the project management committee. We've had people who've been there all along, who we've been wanting to promote to give some more official designation in the project, and we've been able to make those changes recently. So I think having that experience of a turnover in leadership has also been really good for us. We structured the project originally in a way where Nate and I can leave, and it will be able to be just fine without us in the future. And so getting a chance to actually put that into practice, where it's like, okay, well, let's try it. Let's see how leadership changes happen, and see how the project continues. And so far, that's been working. So that's been really big for us too. And then in terms of the software itself, we have a new release every 4 months that contains new features. So essentially, like your Drupal 7 site gets new stuff added constantly if you were maintaining that. And so in the last little while, there's a couple of things that I think are notable in terms of new features. We added a feature called flexible layouts or flexible templates, which is, I guess, they were comparable in Drupal 7 in panels. They were called flexible templates, where it gives you a user interface that you can use to create rows and columns to build your own layout. So you don't have to build it in code. So that was one thing that we got in Backdrop as well. We added the file entity module from Drupal 7, got rolled into core for Backdrop. So now you can have fieldable files and different file types. We have lazy loading images. That was something that went into, I think it's in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 now also. We put it into Backdrop a little differently, again, based on what our target audience needs, but you now have the ability, anytime you define an image field, you can define whether it's to be loaded lazily or greedily or whatever the other option is. We have implemented configuration overrides. So now not only can you manage your configuration in version control using the configuration management system or using the user interface, but you have the ability to override any value in configuration in PHP. So that was something that was missing from early versions of Backdrop. I think it had been in Drupal 8 for a really long time. And we've got that feature now too. And then in the last version of Backdrop, we included a telemetry module, which is something that our community has been clamoring for a really long time. This is a module that will gather statistics about Backdrop sites that are currently running to help us make decisions about what we should do in the future. And that's particularly important because we're trying to make a product that is catering to the people who aren't going to ask for what they want, right? Like we know, 1%, maybe 1 to 10% of people who are using Backdrop are active in the community. But in order to build a product that works best for 100 people, you need to know what the other 90% is doing. And so we've now got a framework in Backdrop core that will allow us to take information like what version of PHP are you running and help us make decisions about when we can drop those slower versions of PHP support. So just having tools like that in place, I think, are going to help make Backdrop a much better product in the long run.
Awesome.
We've also had a collection of events that we've been running. We started them a year ago, so in the middle of the pandemic. So we haven't done any in-person events, but also 3 times a year, we've started doing what we call Backdrop Live, which is essentially a couple of days of guided discussions on various different topics in Backdrop. And rather than being comparable to lots of Drupal events and other online conferences, this is more like a collection of boss. Like we discourage presentations, we discourage screen sharing. It's more about getting everyone in the room around the table to talk about a particular topic. And we did this, first time about a year ago, and we had a massive turnout. We had a lot of people showed up and donated to the project. This was, optional, but they did it anyways. We thought it was really great and just wanted to hear what we were talking about. And it went so well, we decided that we were going to do it more often. So now we do it 3 times a year, and it gives us a chance to do a core release, and we have like a month break, and then we have a live event. And that's been an interesting challenge for us because our community is so globally distributed. Trying to create an event that's agnostic of the time zone is really tricky. So we adopted this format where we do 3 hours on, 3 hours off, 3 hours on, 3 hours off, 24 hours a day. And that way it enables people who are on the opposite side of the globe to pick the sections that work the best for them. And we distribute the content based on who's around to lead the conversation. And I actually found that format works better for me, even in one time zone, because it gives me the ability to like tack on work. And I know probably not the best thing to do, but to attend 3 sessions and then go and make sure nothing's on fire and then come back and attend 3 more sessions. So yeah, it's been a really interesting experiment with online events, but I think it's working really well for our group. So we just had the last one last week, and we had a really big turnout. Again, a lot of people really fascinated to see what's been going on since the last time they tuned into Backdrop. So that's been fun.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that other conferences are kind of, we haven't really explored that time zone agnostic type event, but for NetCamp last year, we did kind of the BOFCon, and this year about a month and a half ago, we decided to go that route again. And yeah, I think it's pretty successful because people can participate, whereas sessions sometimes it's hard to just sit there and just listen to a screen talk to you.
Yeah, we also it's tough because you really want to have people talk to each other. That's the community building aspect of it. And a lot of these online events, you sit in the room, you listen to one person talk, you don't talk to anyone else. And so there's no community building aspect. It's information gathering, but you don't connect in the same way. And so if you say throughout the presentation, everybody sit here and share your own experiences on this topic, you get a lot more involvement, which I think is really important, especially for our community, because we are so globally distributed. We don't get to spend a lot of time with each other, especially in the middle of the pandemic when we haven't seen each other in real life anyway. Getting that face time is really important. But at the same time, like there's a lot of value in having presentations because it generates video content, audio content, transcripts, stuff that can teach people how to do things. And our community is struggling with a little bit on how do we get that same kind of content without having the same kind of event. So there's definitely benefits to having both types of information.
Yep, absolutely. So we've got a few more questions from Matt, who's very interested in this topic, which we really appreciate. We appreciate all the questions they had. They were great questions. So let's get a couple more here. The next one is, have you seen that the contributor community, both on the core side and kind of the contributed module side, move beyond kind of the initial Drupal user base that kind of helped fork in the beginning? Because now it's been 6-7 years since the official announcement. So, are you seeing like a lot of Backdrop first users contributing?
Yeah, so I would say the pool of contributors we have today is very different from the pool of contributors we had on the day we forked or on the day we announced before. And there was a lot of enthusiasm from like existing Drupal people who weren't they were just passionate about the project initially. And now what we're seeing are the people who are using Backdrop in real life are the main contributors to the project. And I wouldn't say that this is beyond the Drupal pool, because most of these people did come from Drupal, but we're seeing people who like have to work on Drupal in their day-to-day life, but they don't want to contribute to Drupal. They want to contribute to Backdrop instead. And sometimes that's because they, believe in the mission. Sometimes it's because they like the project, but sometimes because maybe their day job isn't Drupal at all. We've got some people who are like doctors who contribute to Backdrop. But it's really fascinating to see that. I wasn't expecting that at all. I was expecting everybody to be sort of like me, where you do work as part of your work and then you give it away for free just because you feel like it, not necessarily because you want to spend 8 hours of your off time working on some tricky problem. And we have people who do that, which is nice. We do have people who come back up who don't come from Drupal, but I wouldn't say it's the majority of our user base. I still feel like every week we get new Drupal people showing up in the Backdrop world. And so there's still a constant stream of people who do both Drupal and Backdrop, people who were doing Drupal and are wondering what to do in the future, so they're curious about Backdrop, and people who have switched and decided like my business is now all going to do Backdrop, and so I've got to come and make the things that I need happen over here too. And I think that that's probably going to continue to happen for a while. Backdrop 1 is the version of Backdrop that is backwards compatible with Drupal. There's a backwards compatibility layer built in. We're not planning on removing that layer until Backdrop 2 comes out. Backdrop 2 isn't scheduled until 2025. So that's the time frame we give us, where we figure by 2025, all the people who've decided what they're going to do with their Drupal 7 sites have decided. And we're going to say, okay, now we're dropping the backwards compatibility and we're moving forward in our own direction. So we're sort of expecting our contributor pool to still be people with Drupal experience up until 2025. And at that point, we're going to be like, okay, well, now where are contributors coming from? And hopefully it's just web developers in general. And so we've also been trying to make some of our decisions about what we're doing in core based on the understanding that we're going to be pulling in general web developers who maybe don't have Drupal experience, and trying to write things that are going to be more intuitive for them rather than people who are familiar with Drupal APIs.
I've got kind of the same question, but on the other side of the coin, which is agencies or Backdrop specific companies. So obviously there's a lot of companies out there that specialize in Drupal or WordPress or Django or what have you. I'm curious if you're seeing more companies. You've described your own company as being a Backdrop / Drupal company. I'm curious how many other Backdrop companies there are, if you've been seeing an uptick there as well.
Yeah, so I would say that right now my company is Backdrop and Drupal, but I'm not taking on any new Drupal projects. I'm only taking on either Drupal to Backdrop upgrades or new Backdrop projects. And so I would call myself a Backdrop only company, even though I do still do Drupal. I have clients I really like and projects I've been working on for the last 15 years, and relationships I want to maintain. But for the most part, what I want to do is Backdrop, and I'm hoping to get there. I'm seeing that from other people too. Like we've got people in our leadership, so core developers or PMC members who are focused primarily on Backdrop, but came from Drupal or also do WordPress. And so they have that as part of their offering. But in terms of what we're seeing in terms of new people coming to Backdrop, it's primarily companies that already have Drupal skill showing up saying, we already know how to do this. And so it makes sense for them to say, we already have staff with these skills. We have clients who understand how to use these interfaces. It's going to make a lot of sense for us to add this in because of the learning curve as well. There are a handful of groups that do WordPress and Backdrop and not Drupal. I don't know how that works for them. I don't know if that's maybe just a branding angle where, if you say today that you do Drupal, you're going to get people coming to you wanting Drupal 9. And maybe they're like me, where they're like, I don't want to do that. I want to do Backdrop. So I'm just not going to say I do Drupal, and then people won't ask me for that. But yeah, I would say the majority of the organizations where we have people involved were formerly or are still Drupal agencies, and they just added Backdrop as a list of the services they provide.
Just out of curiosity on the Drupal folks like switching to Backdrop and like wanting to work and build on Backdrop more, like what's the major driver, do you think there? Is it because of the code, or is it because of the feature set, or like what's the reasoning?
So we've had a lot of people show up who were turned off by Composer, where they said, I've been working on Drupal since Drupal 4, and it's this way of managing things doesn't work with the way that I think about projects. And so if they had, especially if they tried it really early when Composer was not great yet, they ran into some issues and was just like, this doesn't make any sense. And so that, there's sort of a learning curve there where people push through it. It's great afterwards. But sometimes hitting that initial roadblock of like, how do I install a module? I don't know how to do this anymore. I'm out. Mm-hmm. It's really hard for people. And so we've gotten a lot of that. We have a handful of people who have attempted Drupal 8 project and failed. And they've come back to us saying, like, I was unable to find the features I needed. All of the stuff I did in Drupal 7 doesn't work anymore, whatever. And I feel like there's a learning curve there too, where when you're doing something in Drupal 8 or Drupal 9, the feature is there. It's just not the same one you used in Drupal 7. You have to do it differently now. It's a different module. It's a different solution. And that's hard for a lot of people too, especially if you haven't done it before. You don't know that. You don't have a network of friends who can help you when you get stuck, or a Twitter account. People are happy to tell you the right way to do things. So those people sometimes come because they've had a hard time with Drupal 8 and they want to try something different. And then they try Backdrop and they have success with Backdrop because it does resonate with the way they've done everything before. That's easier for them. We have a lot of people who are older now, who are developers in their, working years. I don't know if they're retired or, in management or what have you. And they have side projects, and they're like, look, I'm not a developer. I don't need to learn all this newfangled stuff developers do today. I just want to maintain the projects I already have. And so they come bringing, the work that they want to continue maintaining without a huge investment in learning something new.
So I just keep finding more questions. Composer. So you said some people are switching because they're not a fan of Composer. Backdrop does not use Composer.
If you want to use Composer with Backdrop, you can. Okay. One of our core developers wrote a blog post on how he manages his Backdrop sites with Composer, but it's not a requirement. We went the other way where there's now a user interface in Backdrop with a button you can click that'll install any module from the Backdrop contrib world or any theme or any layout. You don't have to leave your website. And so in order to do that, you can't be dependent on a command line tool. It's a very different audience. And I think that, Drupal has sort of decided this is a tool for developers, where Backdrop is a tool for people. We don't care if you're a developer or not. We're going to make it possible for you to do things you want to do. Now, of course, we are a community of developers. So there are people like our core committers who figured out how to run Backdrop with Composer. Sure. But yeah, it's just, we want to make sure that the other end of the spectrum also has the same capabilities to do what they need.
Super interesting to me because I see similarities between where Backdrop has this feature and Drupal doesn't, or Drupal has this feature and Backdrop doesn't. You guys are kind of trading off on which features you're putting into place. I think a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was a couple months ago now, again, time flies in COVID times. We had Chris Wells on talking about Project Browser, which the point of the Project Browser is to be able to see a module and install it right from the UI.
So that is the module that we put into Backdrop Core.
There you go. Look at that. There's another module right there in Backdrop, ready to go for you. That's pretty awesome. So, as I think we all know, Drupal 7 end of life is approaching. Not until next year, but still approaching. Are you expecting, or are you seeing, wider adoption of Backdrop as Drupal 7 end of life approaches?
Yes. I would say about a year ago, I think was when the date move was announced, that it went from 2021 to 2022. And at that time, we saw a flurry of activity where people were just going, oh, I need to think about that, because they'd sort of stopped thinking about it for a while and then they got a reminder. And there were a lot of people who were showed up asking questions. And this year, at this time, we now have a lot of people showing up porting modules. So it's like they've already made a decision and they've started building things, which is different than, it's no longer curiosity, which I think is great. I also see the kinds of groups that we see right now are the ones that have that heavily invested in custom code question to answer. where it's like, okay, we spent the last 10 years now working on this custom code base, and maybe they have something that's very specific for their need, or maybe they just have a handful of things that they just wrote because it was faster to do it that way than whatever other way. And they're now faced with this decision of like, what do I want to keep this thing that I wrote this way? And I think that a lot of people don't really care so much about the technical decisions that we're making in Drupal or Backdrop. Like whatever, I'll learn whatever platform I need, but it's about like what does my organization need? And a lot of times people look at their old Drupal 7 sites and go, well, I don't really need any of this anymore. And so it doesn't matter which platform you choose, because you're going to be rebuilding from scratch anyway. A lot of times people will even look at the migration side of things and say, well, this content all needs to be reviewed and re-entered. And if you want it to be laid out in a nice way with something like paragraph, you have to re-enter that content anyway. And so a lot of them are like, it doesn't matter what software platform you use, because it's a new build, it's a new site, it's data entry. And so it's whatever. And then you see other people who are like, I want everything exactly the way it is now. And for those people, I think it makes a lot more sense to use Backdrop, because you can get everything exactly the way it is in Drupal 7 in Backdrop without needing to change which modules you're using or re-architect your fields, whatever it is that you want changed. So the thing that I think is most interesting, you see all these people saying, I want exactly the same thing. And then they get it in Backdrop and they're like, can you build me something new using the new features? So it's like, well, you did really want something new, you just didn't know. And that's also, a lot of it in terms of timing, where people are pressed up against a deadline of like, oh, I've got this budget and we need to spend it, or, I need to save for a year before I can afford to do this. And so they need to have a plan in place, at a particular time, and what they need a year from now might be different from when they made that decision.
So you had mentioned at the beginning of that question, people porting modules to Backdrop. Are you seeing that as like your users are doing that, or are actual Drupal module maintainers porting kind of their code to Backdrop?
Both. I would say the majority of time it is somebody building a Backdrop site who needs a module who ports someone else's module. Every now and then we see people show up and go, oh, I needed one module, but I realized I have 3 Drupal modules, and so I've moved them all over. And every now and then, so we just had a couple of maintainers for Drupal 8 projects who decided they needed that project to be available for Backdrop too. And in this case, it integrates with an external service. They work for the company that provides the service. They're just making the module available wherever it needs to be. I don't know. I feel like a lot of the time the current maintainers for Drupal 7 projects aren't very active anyway. So the people who are maintaining the Drupal 8 versions of the project aren't the people who are maintaining the Drupal 7 versions of the project. And the Drupal 7 maintainers, you contact them and go, hey, I'm going to port your module. Do you want to be involved? And they're like, no, it's fine. You're like, okay, fine. And I think that we're seeing that across the board, whether it's Drupal 7, Drupal 8, or Drupal 7 Backdrop.
Cool. Are you seeing any adoption increase due to Drupal 8 end of life at all?
I don't think so. At least I don't ask everybody when I meet them, like, why are you here and where did you come from? But I haven't heard anyone say, my Drupal 8 site is reaching end of life and I need to figure out what to do with it. And I think part of that is because if you're stuck on Drupal 8 and can't move to Drupal 9, there's nothing in Backdrop that will help you, right? Like the reason you're stuck on Drupal 8 is because your like Twig version isn't supported anymore or something, and Backdrop doesn't have that. So it's not gonna, I think those people, it would be a lot of work to take their Drupal 8 project running Twig and rewrite its work on Backdrop, and probably less to make it work with the newer versions of Drupal 9. So.
Yeah, I guess with that question, my thinking was like, are there people that are on Drupal 8 that are like, God, Drupal 8 going to Drupal 9, like this is too much. I want to go back to Drupal 7, and like Backdrop seems to be that perfect solution for those folks. So it doesn't sound like that's necessarily the case.
I would say we have people who are on Drupal 8 who are unhappy coming going there who come to Backdrop. But I don't think the end of life is affecting them. I think they're just unhappy with Drupal 8. And I don't know if the end of life is taken that seriously by like site owners. Like they might not know about it. They might not know what it means. They might not understand, what it would mean to move from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. They just care about the way their website is working. And so if they're not happy with the way the website is working, maybe moving to Drupal 9 would have fixed it, but they don't know that.
I would say most, just from my experience, just to kind of fill in that side of it a bit, most of my clients started becoming more serious about Drupal 8 end of life 6 months ago. And then I've got a few companies that have reached out in the last month. They're like, hey, we just found out that it's end of lifing in a month. We need to upgrade. So they're kind of new clients. But yeah, that's the discussion. Like, hey, your site's not going to end, like stop working that day. We have a little bit of time. It's also not going to immediately become vulnerable, but yeah, it's not going to be supported any longer. So we do need to get you moving. And that kind of brings me to the next thing. Like the upgrade process from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 is far simpler than 7 to 8. And I think it's more akin to the Drupal 7 to Backdrop migration. So I'm curious, I know when you first released, one of the big selling points of Backdrop was like, hey, you can just, it's very easy, a few clicks, porting modules is a couple of changes. Has that stayed true in the last 6 years? Is it still, if I have a Drupal 7 site that I need to move to Backdrop that has, maybe 1 or 2 custom modules, is that like a 6-week project, 6-month project, or is it most likely a week in learning Backdrop?
Yeah. So I would say in the last 6 years, it's gotten easier to move a Drupal 7 site to Backdrop. And part of that is because when we forked Backdrop, we actually forked a really early version of Drupal 8. And so we included a lot of breaking changes in that first few years of Drupal 8 development. And since we released Backdrop, we've been adding backwards compatibility in for stuff that wasn't there before. So anytime we find like a function that was removed, we're like, oh, we need to add a wrapper function for that. And we need to add a deprecation notice so that people who are check your logs, you can see that that function was deprecated and update your custom code as needed. The upgrade path also for contrib modules, as with any open source project, gets better with time, right? More people use it, you find more bugs, you fix more bugs. So I would say it's easier today to move from Drupal 7 to Backdrop than it was 6 years ago, even 1 year ago, maybe. But it's not nothing, right? Like it's very different from a migration. You don't have to have a separate website and move your data into it. You just drop the new code on your current site and hit update, and it'll update itself. But there are little differences you have custom modules. They'll work with variables if you want variables in the database, but you probably want to use configuration management. And that is going to require a little work to get those variables out of the database and into code so you can manage them. And I think that scares some people away. I think, for an example, you were describing a site with 2 custom modules. I would say that would be a day of work if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, I give you a week to learn some of the differences. And I think the biggest differences are mostly conceptual ones, right? Like this database variables versus configuration variables, figuring out how to make those changes, what those upgrade hooks look like. And then the biggest one is switching from layouts being defined by your theme to layouts being theme agnostic and working across any theme. And if you're upgrading from Drupal, there is a way that you can have all of your block placements for Drupal become your layout placements in Backdrop, but you need to know how to do that. And so that's something that's sort of like a super advanced, only experts know how to do this feature. And so most people moving are just like, I'll just replace my block. And that's fine if you've got 4 blocks in one sidebar. But if you have one of those sites that has 100 blocks with different placements on different pages, you don't want to lose that and have to recreate all of that, especially if you want the same site at the end as you had in Drupal 7.
As we move into the retrospective portion of our show here, Jen, anything you would have done differently now that it's been 6+ years since the release of Backdrop?
Well, the one thing that we've learned is that we should have actually forked Drupal 7 and not early Drupal 8, because then we wouldn't have to go back and be putting in all these backwards compatibility wrappers for things. I think that would have made it a lot easier for people. It's tough because I feel like the things that are hardest for people coming from Drupal are things that really make Backdrop a much better product. So like configuration management, it's like hard to imagine living in a world without it today. It's so easy. It makes everything just so much more convenient in terms of maintaining a site over the long term. But it is a big like mental shift, and people are like, where do I put these files? How do I manage them? What's important? What's not important? How does the staging work? And we have user interfaces for everything. You can manage it through Git, whatever, however you want to do it. But it is such a different way of thinking about things that people really struggle with. And the same thing I feel with layouts. You know, trying to make a page on a Drupal site is hard. Just one page, homepage. I want it to look different from the other pages. And that's been a really hard problem for Drupal in a really long time. That's a soft problem in Backdrop, so you need to know how to do it. And there's a lot of complexities to the layout system that, you know, you can have a standalone page, you can have a page that overrides an existing page. What's the difference between those two? How do I define them? How do I control them? Like, how do I make the same thing across multiple layouts? There's solutions to all these problems, but it's a very different way of doing it in Drupal than you did it in Backdrop, or vice versa. So just trying to get people to understand those differences is really hard. So part of me is like, if I was going to do it again, I might want to make it more similar somehow, but I don't know. It's such a good feature once you get it. It's yeah, hard to really regret.
So this might be a tough question. I'm going to interject, but I'm also interested kind of on the other side. I mean, and I may be misremembering, but I remember one of the reasons why when you guys forked was because of the philosophy change between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. Not just with Composer, but also object-oriented programming, just kind of rewriting things from the ground up. And I'm not trying to give the impression that you guys are doom and gloom, really, but I'm curious if, looking back now that it's been several years, of kind of those reasons that you made the decision to fork have been borne out in Drupal 8. If like, and I know that you've changed your philosophy too, like you're no longer just the Drupal fork, you know, you're a more user-friendly, non-developer maintainer site. You know, you've kind of etched that niche out, but I'm curious if, you know, if there were any things that kind of happened over the last 8 years that you were like, hey, I was sure that was going to be a bigger problem than it was in Drupal 8, or, you know, hey, that's the reason why we did Backdrop in the first place, and it ended up being just as big a pain as we thought it was going to be.
I would say the majority of what happened was, you know, we said, hey, these 18 things are going to be problems. And the Drupal community said, we don't care. And we forked and we did things the way we wanted to. And then over the next 8 years, Drupal community went, oh, turns out those things are big problems, and started changing to do things the way Backdrop was doing them. So things like backwards compatibility, that's the number one thing for us. Is it's like maintainer of the web form module, top 10 module for Drupal, had a website, webform.com, provides web forms as a service. He looked at what's it going to take for me to move my software as a service platform from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. I have to invest hundreds of hours, and at the end I get nothing. It's exactly the same as it was before. And it clicks in his head, like, this is not a good decision for a software platform. So he's like, well, what would it take to move webform.com, you know, to an equivalent version of a software platform that didn't involve a complete rewrite? And so that I think it hit Drupal really hard that was a problem. And now they know, like, Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 is going to be easy, Drupal 9 to Drupal 10 is going to be easy, and it's written in a way that all of that is, you know, they know that it's fixed, right? They realize the problem that happened, and that's resolved. Semantic versioning, like, we've been on semantic versioning for a really long time. Drupal made the shift to match semantic versioning too. I don't know how Contrib is going to handle that going forward. It seems to be working, but it's the kind of thing that, like, you know, we knew that was going to be an issue, adopted it early, and Drupal came around to it too. releasing on a schedule, right? That was something we've worked on. We're like, you can't just say it's ready when it's ready. It's got to be ready on a timeline. And now Drupal has that as well, and they have a schedule. So it's like most of the stuff that we predicted that was going to be a problem did turn out to be a problem, and Drupal has now also adjusted. So we're moving more parallel, but it's not because it turned out not to be a problem. It's because the Drupal community did move slow. And part of that is a huge community. It took a really long time to turn this ship. Yeah, I don't feel like any of the things that we thought were going to be a problem turned out not to be a problem. We never had an issue with object-oriented programming. Backdrop is a lot more object-oriented than Drupal 7. Like, nodes are real objects. All of the classes in Backdrop are real classes. Blocks are classes. Layouts are classes. Like, everything that makes sense to be object-oriented is object-oriented. There's just a lot of stuff that doesn't have to be. And so why change it? Because you need to have it backwards compatible. Or if you make blocks into objects, right? How does the current block hooks work? Oh, we just added a class called legacy, block legacy, that implements the hook. So it's just about every time we make the same decision, we do it in a way with backwards compatibility being our number one concern. Yeah. And that was the thing that I think got us most concerned about Drupal 8. It's like there are hundreds of thousands of websites that are now going to have to make this investment, this massive financial time, all of the stuff that's involved in updating your site or getting a new site. And what do they get out of the same thing at the end as they had at the beginning? So I think for a lot of people who have budget to redo their website every year and have to do it, it doesn't matter, right? Because they're going to invest the money and they're going to build something new and they're going to migrate to it. And the way that Drupal went matches that. And I know I worked at Chapter 3 for a while, which managed a lot of these really great, big, complicated websites. And every year we had the same clients rebuild the same website. And that was just part of their marketing strategy. They had to rebrand, they had to do whatever. And that was just the way it worked. And I feel like Drupal 8 caters to that audience, and that's fine. But there's all of these people in Drupal 7 who don't have the luxury of doing that, who are sort of stranded. And Backdrop was like, we can't help them. So that's why.
Do you think
that's it?
Do you think that Drupal 8 is shifting away from that now, though, with the fact that it's easier to upgrade from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9, and now those massive rebuilds that would take place are now going to be basically like maybe content reorganization and rethemes as opposed to like complete rewrites?
Yeah. Drupal learned that lesson, right? They're not going to do that again.
I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, of course, I think it's going to be easier. And I think, if they hadn't learned that lesson, that would have been really bad. But if they'd asked people to make that massive commitment once and then ask them to do it again 5 years later, then people would be dropping the fly. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that statement, because I think I would say, maybe this is a hindsight thing, but I think I would say that it wasn't so much that Drupal completely ignored that question and then went, oh God, we shouldn't have done this. It was more like, I think on some level, a lot of it was like, we know there's going to be a lot of pain in this, but let's have that pain now for the benefits of having Symfony underneath and all, getting off the island. And we'll fix those things when we get there. But then again, that could be hindsight. I'm also curious too, because you had mentioned webform.com. I'm just curious if Nate has spent more time supporting and building Backdrop than it would have taken to get webform.com from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Probably. But
he's also spent a lot more time supporting Webform than he did any website you put it on. So I mean, there is like the nature of a maintainer where you're just you like helping people and solving problems. And if you can help 100 people solve a problem, you solve one. There's something about that that's rewarding too. I did want to say though, what you think? Oh, about the benefits of being on Symfony and all this other stuff. That's something that only matters to core developers. And so, like as a site owner, I don't care if my site's on Symfony or not. Nate doesn't care if his site was going to be on Symfony or not, right? And in the long term, that turns out to be really hard for that's why Drupal 8 is end of life, right? So there's some things where it's like whether that's a benefit or not depends on who's your audience. And so I think that's another really clear distinction of why Backdrop is for a different audience, right? These are people, we just want a website, right? Versus Drupal, it's like, oh no, this is a developer tool and developers care. about that sort of thing. It's another very clear distinction that, you know, Drupal used to be for everyone, and now it's like, okay, this is no longer for everyone. This is for an audience, and Backdrop is for a different audience.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I also think that, you know, this is kind of the age-old issue with contribution in general. You know, obviously Nate maintained and built the web form module for years, and then, you know, when he announced he was no longer going to maintain it for Drupal 8, eventually Jacob Rockowitz kind of took up that torch and has done a fantastic job. And then earlier this year, his company was moving away from Drupal, and he was no longer going to really, he was like considering stepping back from web form. And I'm sure, you know, somebody would have taken that torch up again. But, you know, that, I think that's one of the reasons why I love this kind of discussion, because it's, you know, it's something that all open source communities need to solve. Like, one of the benefits, you said Symfony is for core developers, but making it easier for core developers to maintain or switch out long-term, like you said that you guys have done for leadership on the Backdrop side, you know, that's sustainability, right? But then again, if you change your product to be sustainable for a very small group, then, you know, the project is the community, the project is people using it, right? So there, it's a really fine line. I think it's really hard to strike that balance, and it can be solved different ways. I think Backdrop certainly has solved it, you know, in one way, and Drupal, I think, has certainly solved it in a very different way.
Yeah, and I think that also, like, it all points to the philosophy of the project, right? Where we believe that we get developers by making the project so easy for people to use that you can just, that on-ramp is really flat. And you just get anyone who's a web developer to show up one day and contribute to the project. And then they get, oh, I've got core contributions in Backdrop, I'm going to start using this. And then now all of a sudden they're like invested. It's very different than like, okay, we're going to take our existing maintainers and like make it easier for all the people who already know how to do all this stuff. Sort of a different philosophy on where you're going to get that contributor base from. And Drupal also has the, you know, ability to do that because they have the largest contributor base in any open source project. They've got more flexibility to make that decision. Where like us, we're brand new, like if we're going to limit our contributors to our core contributors when there's only 2, we're really going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
So what would you say are your biggest roadmap features that you're looking forward to now?
Oh man, okay. So one thing I'm really looking forward to is automatic updates. That's something that it's been on the roadmap for us for a long time. And when we put in manual updates where you push the button and the site updates itself, that was sort of next in line to happen. And I'm not sure you guys know Backdrop has a fork silk screen, the fork of Backdrop. It's like the press flow of Backdrop. The main maintainer of Silkscreen has been working with Nate on ways to improve the automatic update process, and they've got a couple of pull requests in core on how to resolve that. And it looks like that is getting closer to being included. Maybe not the next release, but the one after that. So I'm really excited about seeing that, especially as someone who I maintain a lot of little sites. So finding a way to keep those people safe. You know, even if they don't get back to me for 6 months about needing some feature, my usual workflow is anytime anyone asks for anything, I update their site. But if they don't ask for anything for 6 months, you know, there's vulnerabilities out there. I want to make sure that they stay on top of them. Obviously, if there's something terrible, I contact everyone and tell them, Drupal getting accepting, we got to fix this. But yeah, it would be nice to not have to worry about that and have those people continue to take care of themselves. So I'm really excited about automatic updates.
So did I hear you correctly? There is a fork of Backdrop?
Yes, Silkscreen, the fork of Backdrop.
Interesting.
Wasn't PressFlow for like varnish and performance?
Yes, same thing with Silkscreen. So Backdrop is, of course, making a bunch of decisions based on who our target audience is and where people are running on shared hosting and maybe don't have like dedicated like search systems or you know, layers of performance caching, multiple databases, that sort of thing. But you need to still be able to run Backdrop on a site with multiple databases and multiple web servers. But that's really hard to do on the current course. It's not really a priority for us. But if it was possible in Drupal 7, we can do it in Backdrop. So he's maintaining a fork of Backdrop that contains the same features. If you want to run an alternative database to MySQL, you can do it on Silkscreen. You can't do it on Backdrop. So there's some decisions we made about what benefits the 80%. That's what we focus on for core. Multiple web servers, multiple databases, alternate databases to MySQL, not 80% features, not in core. But what does that 20% do, right? So they're gonna have Silkscreen that option.
So
makes sense.
I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, and you can choose to say, I don't know, we'll see as an answer. That's totally acceptable. But who's going to get to core updates first, Drupal or Backdrop?
That's a good question. I don't know. I feel like we have been closer for a really long time, but we also move slower. We've done this particular feature. So it could be the Drupal gets there first.
I don't know. I think the composer wrinkle is going to throw a little bit of extra time on the Drupal solution, but I don't know. Maybe not.
It could. I mean, the project browser initiative is also working on the automated composer stuff in the back end too. So like they're
actually using the automatic update stuff. So
yeah, they're both feeding off each other. I know. So
more hands on deck, always good.
You mentioned adding telemetry, which is always a hot button topic in any project, but I'm curious if you can share any kind of usage statistics for Backdrop. What you're seeing.
Telemetry? So we only telemetry in the last core version, and it's not enabled by default. So the only people who are currently reporting telemetry data are people who know the module is there and have chosen to turn it on.
Okay.
So that's like our core developers for the most part. So I could tell you like what the Backdrop servers are running. I can't tell you what our entire audience is. We've got some issues to sort out with opt-in, opt-out before we enable by default. We want to make sure everybody knows it's there, knows it's on, and has the ability to opt out if they want to. We also are only currently collecting web server version, PHP version, MySQL version. We have a really long list of things we want to include in that list of data. But in order to get it in and get it working, we sort of minimize the viable product there. So yeah, I mean, right now we don't have anyone running PHP 5.3 reporting, but I wouldn't expect that audience to be on old PHP anyway.
So Jen, you've made it to the end of the show. Is there anything you'd like to tell our listeners, or anything you'd like to talk about briefly before we wrap things up?
Nothing I can think of.
All right, great. I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal, in the Talking Drupal channel on Drupal Slack, and email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. And as you've heard this show, if you do send us questions on Twitter, we will ask our guests. Our newsletter has also gone through some changes recently. We added some links to upcoming Drupal camps and local meetups. Last week's newsletter debuted Chad's Book Corner, where currently the most frequent guest and co-host, Chad Hester, recommends some of the books that he's been reading on technology, professional growth, and health. You can visit talkingdrupal.com/newsletter to sign up.
You can also promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal. Learn more about that at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron.
Jen, thanks again for joining us. And if our listeners wanted to reach out to you or learn more about Backdrop, how could they go about doing that?
So our Backdrop's website is backdropcms.org. There's a lot of great information there. Best place to reach me are probably by Twitter. I am at Jen Lampton on Twitter. And Backdrop, if you were into Twitter, Backdrop is also Backdrop CMS on Twitter.
Yeah, you did an awesome job answering those questions from Matt right there on Twitter too. So if anybody's looking for that conversation, it's on Twitter. April, we're looking forward to the next 3 weeks. How can folks get a hold of you if they're interested?
I'm on Twitter as well, week before next.
There you go. Everybody's on Twitter these days. Nick, what about you? Are you on Twitter?
I am. You can reach me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me at picozzi.com. That's PICOZZI.com. And if you want to learn more about EPAM or come work with me, you can learn about EPAM at EPAM.com.
Where's the Backdrop community then? That's something maybe I can try to find a way to insert this in the show because I think that's important.
So we hang out on a chat platform called Zulip, which is an open source version of Slack, essentially. It's accessible to web browser. You can use your GitHub login. So we tried to make it integrate with everything we already have. That's where we chat. We have a forum.backdropcms.org for people who aren't interested in live chat or would prefer to use that style of interaction. The core issue queue, the contribute to queues. I mean, issue queues in general, it's not a place to like hang out. But that's where to find us, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, we have weekly meetings every Thursday, one at 1 p.m. Pacific and 1 at 2 p.m. Pacific, where we chat about various different things. Every week, the second meeting is always a like core development check-in, and the first meeting is alternates between design and outreach. And we have like an open Q&A section at the end of every one of those meetings. So if you have a question that has nothing to do with any one of those topics, you can still show up and be like, hey, how do I do whatever?
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Have a good one, everyone.